What's up, everybody? Welcome to Worship Matters. I'm Jonathan. This is my great friend and our worship leader, Jason.
Great to meet y'all.
So
Glad to be on. Glad to be on the show.
glad to have you. We've been talking about coming on for having him on here for a while, so we can talk about worship. And today we're gonna just talk about go through the worship guidelines again. And Jason has a different perspective on some of these than I do, and I felt like it would be a good, helpful balance to kind of see how we can discuss these things and with maybe some disagreements. In a lot of things we generally agree. So
Yeah, I think for the most part, and you can pull up the guidelines if you want. We kind of fall in the same category. It's like I do all of the tests except for one, and we'll get there.
Right.
Or I use the test in a different way, I think, than you.
Right.
But
before we jump into that, if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. If you enjoy this video, give us a like. And if you have anything, any songs or anything about worship you'd like me to talk about, let me know in the comments. Also, if you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments. We'd love to hear and discuss with that. So let's do this. So here's our worship guidelines: directional, musically repeatable, theologically sound, the Bob test, artistic license, and congregational versus personal. Now, I have done several videos about these. I'll link the original one in the video. It is a bit dated. But basically, the rundown here, if you're new and you don't know what any of these mean, directional is basically the idea that worship is to somebody. And we are directing our worship to God. So we should, in our songs, direct worship to God. Now, there's more to that. We'll get into the weeds in a little bit. But musically repeatable. I get this from Martin Luther, who talks about songs that are so complicated that people were unable to remember. And so he strove to write songs that the church could remember and sing. They were musically repeatable, songs that the people could remember. They were simple enough so that anybody can pick them up. I'm adding to it now. They're simple enough to where any church can sing them. That's not to exclude bigger churches who have bigger things could play bigger, more complicated songs. But in general, for general purposes, it's good to have them.
The focus
simple.
is on the melody and the lyrics.
Right.
The melody's not too crazy. So you might have a church that has a full orchestra, or you might have a church that has a massive praise band, or you might have one person on a piano or one person on a guitar. And in any of those situations, the melody's not going to be crazy and unmemorable.
Right. So. Theologically sound speaks for itself. We want it to make sure that it adheres with the truth. The Bob test is one that I got from a seminary professor, and basically it is if we can replace the words you or Lord or God with Bob, and it makes sense as a love song, maybe not the best worship song. Artistic license is really just my way of saying that artists are going to write words differently. And so even though I wouldn't have put or phrased things certain ways, it's really just my way so that I can give people a little more grace than maybe my critical mind would. And then congregational versus personal really is just to talk about two distinct areas of worship. We have our congregational, where the time where we come together as a church to worship together, and then we have personal worship, where we are on our own time worshiping God every day. So those are the guidelines. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. So I think starting with directional, like when I go through my process of picking songs for worship, obviously I want to find songs that direct, like clear, direct praise to God. Like,
right.
Lord God, we worship you.
Yeah.
Or like, we sing praise because of these things to you. But I think one of the things that I don't want to lose in saying, like, this is one of our main guidelines for worship is if we are quoting scripture or we're quoting attributes of God, even if we're not directing them directionally at God in the moment, there is indirect praise of God. And so directional often doesn't become one of my main look fors. Now, if I were only doing indirect praise all the time, then it's like, okay, I gotta watch the songs that I'm putting in there. Um, but I think there's a lot to be taken from even in the indirect praise. That generally it doesn't become one of my guidelines, and it only becomes one if I plan out a set of music for a service and all of them are indirect or all of them are not clear that the worship is going to God.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I think, and we've talked about this, but I think that there's also this idea of indirect worship where we are talking about God, talking about the great things of God, and I think that that's a good form of song, of lyrics. For me, I think that a lot of more modern songwriting has gotten to the point where it's all vague. They're just talking to this general idea, and and the reason why it is for me, one, it's not that I want every song to be directional. I mean, I kind of do, but at the same time, I think that artistically it works well to talk about God and the great things of God, and that indirectly gives Him praise. And so, really, one of the reasons on that side is that I just want more songs that speak directly to God, to remind us that we are like in conversation with God Almighty. We're not just singing about Him.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think we need to have more songwriters saying, "Hey, let's sit down with our lyrics. Let's run our lyrics by pastors. Let's run it by other church members that are deep in their word and say, hey, do you feel like if you were singing this song, it was clear that your praise is directed to God? It's not just a vague emotional response line."
Yeah.
And I think some of my focus on directional not being one of my key guidelines, though it's like a helpful guideline, is probably more on the artistic license side.
Okay.
In the sense, there's a song that we do that I had written, but it's essentially just a direct quote of Psalm 107.
Right.
And
it's a good song.
The main text in the chorus is, "Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, His faithful love endures forever." That statement in itself is not actually giving thanks.
Right.
It's telling people to give thanks.
Directing people to do the action.
But it's, even though that song isn't directly praising God, it's directly addressing the people to say, you should give your praise to God.
I would call it indirect praise.
Yeah, and so, though directionally, it's not direct.
Right.
Directionally, it is direct in telling people that is our goal, that is our outcome. In the same way of singing a song that may just, I'm trying to think of one that does it, that just essentially reads out the gospel of Jesus came, Jesus died, Jesus rose again, Jesus is reigning
Lord,
again.
lift name on high.
Well, but that begins with Lord, or it begins and ends with it. But if it didn't have that last phrase and just said the gospel, I wouldn't be like, well, but it didn't. Not saying that you do. Obviously, you watch his videos. Jonathan's not doing that. But I think when I say guidelines wise, I'm like, no, it didn't directly give praise to God, but by saying the gospel, we are praising God because of the things, without having to then at the end have to add a tagged word. And I guess this gets into a little artistic license if we want to bounce around here. I think there is some artistic license of, as long as we are speaking truths of God, you don't need to just add a lot, like get to the end of writing a song and being like, oh, this is beautiful, the text works great, the words are true, and it's musically repeatable, but I didn't put a direct line, so now I gotta go rewrite everything to add in a direct line. Unless you sit there and you're like, oh, if I just change this word to you versus we, or whatever, unless it's one of those things. I think there's a lot of worship songs that I sit there and people were like, why are you complaining about this? I'm like, because literally you just had to change one word. And it means the same thing you wanted to say, but it's clearer.
Right. Dude, I love the idea of changing some songs from you or me to us and we. I feel like, especially congregationally, personal worship, I think, you're by yourself, but even by myself, sometimes I'll sing us or we, but, thinking of congregational worship, like the idea that we're singing together, and we're singing about each other, I think that really unites us together.
Yeah. And there's not a ton, but there's a few recently that I've seen that like the last verse or
Right,
the
we'll do
repeat of the
that.
bridge they'll flip and change it, and I think
Yeah.
that's just a really neat way. Even just in a song to say, "Hey, I am giving worship. Like your faith doesn't save me; it's the Lord imparting to me in
Right.
my like personal relationship." But us together means something too. Like
Right.
all the reading in Ephesians about the church is one body and like you can't lose a part. Like if we lose that understanding of the church, that the corporate body does matter, I think we miss part of the gospel.
Right.
So
Yeah. I think the other side of directional is I think there are songs that are written that are very personal, and sometimes I think there's some songs that just seem like the direction is the self rather than God, and like there are really I think there's definitely some secular songs that do this where they worship themselves rather than God. And I think that there are some, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there's been some songs over the years that are Christian that I've definitely been like, is this really like worshiping God, or is this really trying to glory themselves?
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't really have that problem to a lot of the songs that I review, but just as that's another side of the coin of directional there, that we actually want our worship to be directed to God and not other things, you know.
Yeah.
I don't think you'd really disagree.
No, I don't disagree with that at all.
All right.
Musically repeatable. We're on the same page.
Yeah.
Let's write songs that aren't hard to remember.
Yeah.
Let's write songs that are. And my thing, I think, with musically repeatable, and it's no different from what you're doing, but maybe just said in a different way, is the instrumentation around it. Do what you want. Like, if you have the ability to run a full orchestra, like, don't be like, oh, well, we couldn't repeat that in another surface,
Right.
so we shouldn't do it now. Like, that is not at all the point. But we shouldn't be writing songs that are so wide of a range that only the people that have degrees in vocal training at the highest levels and have these ranges of like 4 octaves could sing. It's like, hey, let's make sure we put it in octaves that are able to sing. And this is less of writing the songs, but like as we're doing them in corporate worship, like I love Cody Carnes. Cody Carnes has a really high voice. I'm not going to sing Cody Carnes at the key that he records it in. I'm not saying he should record it there because that's where it fits
It's like
well for his voice.
Chris Rice or Chris Tomlin.
Chris Tomlin sings really high. Phil Wickham sings really high, and I think they would all
Kristen
say
Getty.
like, well, if you even Getty sings high. Well, and Kristen sings low, but it becomes high for men and low for sopranos. So it just becomes in a weird key.
Sorry, I'm a guy, so I just know it is high.
Yeah. But like thinking through songs and saying, all right, well, for the recording purpose, maybe it was great to do it here.
Right.
But when we're sitting down, and you'll even see Phil Wickham has some like hymn sing-along albums, and he puts the keys of the songs lower than the way he recorded them originally because you hear the room singing louder.
Right, and I think that's part of that is because of like the reality of Christian music these days. Is a lot of it is written for concerts and for touring, and some of them don't really write it for the church. I mean, they write it for the church in that they're writing it for the people of God, but they're not thinking of how can I write this in a key or in a melody that's easy for any old church to pick up and sing this song, or so that the general body of people can actually stay in tune. Some people think about that. Don't get me wrong, but some of it's really meant to show the skill of the singer, and that's perfectly fine for that context.
Well, and I think that I put the much less on the writer and much more on the worship leader.
Right.
Is just because you heard it on his radio or just because you heard it on Spotify and Apple Music in this key and it fits your voice really well, that doesn't mean you should go out and lead it in that key. and vice versa. Even if it's a key that you didn't hear it in, I try as hard as I can to not go out and pick a key just because it fits my voice. If we were going to do that, I'd sing really high. Not crazy high. I don't have that high of a voice, but I would sing higher than I would normally do. And I think it also varies. Like, you'll hear people talk about keys for singing, like, oh, everything should fit between a C to C range. And I think that general practice is fine. But I know after I've been almost 2 years at Grace, pretty close to it, I found out, like, our congregation just happens to be able to sing, like, D sharp and E flats and stuff. And the occasional E.
And if we can't, we sing harmony.
Well, yeah, and nobody pulls out. Yeah. Where I've also served at a church that if I gave them a C sharp, they would not sing it. And if you're not musically inclined to understand all the, like, technical terms, that's a much lower note than singing an E. And so I pick different keys for those for that context than I do for Grace. And I even pick usually higher keys when I lead at, like, a youth conference, because kids have generally higher voices, or if they don't, they're fine to just scream. So
I think we can also say, like, there's this other category for, like, special music and choir, which I know that probably not everybody likes, but I love both. I don't like the dependence on them. So if I had a choice between having a special music or a choir and having congregational worship or congregational singing, I'm going to go with congregational singing. But if I could do both, I would do both. Yeah. I feel like at least every now and then, I think it's really special to have a choir or have a special song. And for those kind of settings, like, it's okay to have more difficult, more technical songs, because the goal in those is more of like a teaching than it is like a congregational singing. Yeah. And so I think that and you just hear the beauty of music, which, you know, I think is great. So I don't think that every technically difficult song we should avoid from the church, but specifically these guidelines are for congregational singing. So
yeah, no, I'm all on board with that. I think we can lead into looking more at the theologically sound. I think we fall in the same boat with that. I think my only caveats different with theologically sound are just mine with artistic licenses. Yeah. I generally go at it and I say, if I read this, does it go against my theology? Right. And if it doesn't, I'm just going to be like, all right, they said it in a different way than me, and unless it's like, I'm generally not the biggest fan of reckless love, because I think that gives an idea that is beyond what's going on. Like, the Lord is not reckless, and I get the call. I get the call for reckless love. Like, I understand the emotional, like, His love seems to us to be reckless, because how could a God love such a sinful people the way He does? So I get the emotional response, but I have seen situations where people are like, oh yeah, God just loves us way beyond rationality. And I'm like, no, He doesn't.
He's very rational.
Very within rational, but He's
spitting fire here.
He's so rational and He's so beautiful that it goes beyond our rationality.
Right.
And so I won't pick to sing or play it, but if I'm at a concert, I'm not going to just stop singing it, because it's like, I know what they mean, and I know I don't mean that. So I may listen to it even in personal worship.
There's a lot of songs that I would sing at another church that I wouldn't like choose in leading, you know. And that's fine. I think we're Baptists. We don't mind other churches, you know, choosing differently than us to some extent.
I think also not theologically sound, but in the sense of when I write music. Not that I'm not going to write a song about immersion baptism, but generally I'm going to be maybe a little bit more vague when it comes to these kind of. If we look at people who use the idea of like theological triage, like, what are the things that define you as being a Christian? Like, if you don't have these things, you can't even say you're a Christian. What are the things that say, oh, I'm a Christian, but I lean into these categories generally? Or what are the things that it's like, okay, even the people that agree on the top and the second, they disagree and still gather together. On really even the second tier things, I generally try to keep it a little bit more vague when I'm writing, for the sake of, like, I don't want my Presbyterian brothers and my Anglican friends to, which I'm not saying friends and brothers as if they're different levels from me, just using a different term, but I want them to be able to sing it too.
Right.
And so I might write a song at some point up talking about immersive baptism, and only the Baptists and the non-denominers are gonna sing it.
The real Christian. No, I'm kidding.
but generally, I do try to lean away from some of those things because I want more and more. So in Theologically Sound, I'm really trying to focus as much as I can on that top tier. It's like, these are the things that if we remove them, we no longer consider you a Christian.
Right.
I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, no, I think generally, as long as it's not heretical or like it's a major doctrine that our church disagrees with, I don't see a problem with it.
All right, you ready for the?
Let's do the Bob test.
This is where the rub comes in.
That's right.
So my stance on the Bob test, I don't dislike the Bob test, but I don't use the Bob test in the sense of I think if we're in a church worship service and we've been saying all day long, we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about the resurrection, we're talking about the hope that's given, and then we get into a point of the service and we sing a song that if you completely removed it from the entire context, you could try to make the argument it's not about God. It's real clear in the context that it is. Now, if that's our only song, then I'm going to start using the Bob test. I'm going to be like, hey guys, we came out to worship today and we sang 6 songs, and without all the context, you would have no idea.
Right.
Then I'm going to say, all right, maybe we shouldn't be using these songs. But I think in the context, if you even have one song that's super clear and you have a pastor or a preacher or somebody that's proclaiming the gospel clearly, and maybe even right before the song, I think sometimes when I lead songs that maybe are not as directionally clear, I'm going to be like, hey, we're singing this song because of the gospel. We're singing this song because of what Christ did, to remind people, like, hey, this is not just a love song.
Yeah.
So that's mine on the Bob test. I don't fully disagree, but I would not put it in as a worship guideline in the sense of, as soon as we start saying, all right, we're going to pretend like all the context isn't there, then it's like, well, then what can we use if we're going to remove context?
I guess one thing is I like songs that are individually consistent or individually clear. So especially for the worship of God, where I don't have to think about what this song means, especially when we're talking about congregational worship. Personal worship, I love listening to vague songs that may or may not be Christian that I can interpret in Christian ways. You know, that's just me, because I see God's glory in all of creation. Even the pagans, whether they try or try not to, they're gonna somehow show the glory of God in what they're doing in art. But when we're coming to the congregational worship, I like things to be very clear. And I don't think I've ever failed any song just because it failed the Bob test. Like, if it passes all the other things, I'll probably still pass it for congregational. With just a caveat that maybe I would, like, if I were leading, I would explain it. I'd be like, I would kind of bridge the songs together by specifically talking about how Jesus is the one that fulfills whatever we're singing about. That would probably be the only thing I would add if I were leading.
Yeah.
But I think really the spirit of this, and I may have expanded it a little bit in my own practice, but I think the original idea was just that, like, these vague love songs that we see aren't really appropriate for if the only difference, like, if I write a song about Bob and then somebody comes along and just changes Bob for God, like, that doesn't really seem appropriate for worship, and the idea is kind of vice versa. Like, love songs to God are great, especially for personal worship, because we love God and we want to sing. You know, we are the bride of Christ as the church. But I just want to be careful about, like, writing these vague songs that really are just a generic love song that, you know, really could be applied to anybody, and they don't really say anything about God, or You know, that's really the hesitation. I don't think I've ever failed a song just because of that. But and again, I've expanded a little bit, but that's really the heart of where I'm coming from on that one.
Yeah, I think I was trying to think through as you were saying all that, how to express this plainly. I think the thing with the Bob test also comes to an issue when artists often have very spiritual, religious like mindsets, even non-Christian artists. And so a lot of times they'll actually write phrases that sound like they're talking about God.
Right.
Now, they're not. They're talking about the person they're in love with, but they're so in love with them that the only ways they can best express it are in similar categories to the way we describe God.
Right.
And just because I think secular or people that are not singing about God or about our God are using those same terms, I don't want to say, all right, now we can't use those terms because they're good terms. They're good terms to describe them. And so because more and more people have started describing other gods or just not the Christian God with the Christian God's attributes and terms, we can almost hear songs and be like, well, somebody else could have written it about him. And I'm like, well, yeah, but so could a Christian reading their Bible write this about God. So I think that's where I come with the Bob test. And I think also if we lose context entirely, if you don't mind me throwing you under the bus a little bit here, we've talked about this before. There was a song probably a couple months back now called "You Will Be Found" that you did a review of because it was getting played on Christian radio. Because was it Natalie Grant and somebody who did it? But the song
I've put it out of my mind.
So it was Christian artists did a version of it, and so then it got played on Christian radio all the time. It's a song from the musical Dear Evan Hansen, which musically, it's a great musical. Has nothing to do with God. The song itself has nothing to do with God, and the musical itself is actually really humanistic focused of like we can save each other, which there was some goodness of like, hey, we should not isolate ourselves. We should be with people, and I'm all for that. But now a Christian artist plays it, and I don't think they put it out thinking that this is now a worship song. But now it's getting played on Christian radio, and so people without the context, or you just pulling it up and being like, well,
I found
Christian
it on a list that said
it.
top Christian songs of today, and I was like,
and it's not even.
I didn't realize it was it was some pull up a song from some musical or whatever.
So there is some of the Bob test. Doesn't really fail you because that actually helped you in that part because you looked at the song and you said, no, this doesn't seem to be talking about God. But because of the context, they said that it was, which is unhelpful. So hopefully if we are singing accurate songs that may be vague and we're putting it in a good, right context for God, I would pull back on the Bob test. But again, if all of our songs fail the Bob test, then we have a problem. But if one of our songs fails, I'm still putting it in the set as long as it makes sense for what we're doing.
I guess I kind of put it in the same weight as directional. Like if all of my songs were indirect, I might look toward mixing a couple of them out with songs that are direct. And similar with the Bob test, like if a few of them pass on every other measure. But they're a little vague. We're in the context of congregational worship. It's not that big a deal. Like, and we can bridge those gaps. That's one of the nice things about being a worship leader is you can bridge those gaps in what you say, and you can kind of get your congregation to think about what they're singing, rather than just like trust the song to do everything for you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think we don't have to go over artistic license.
I just like to give as much grace as I can, and I realize that I'm a stickler and kind of a grouchy person, and so like I want to give them as much grace as I can. Just because they would word it differently or they don't use complete sentences, like I try to put that in the
I'm a big fan of
license.
sentences. I'm a poetic mind. If you didn't finish the sentence, I get what you're saying.
Dude, old poetry used complete sentences. It's only modern poetry.
Sometimes there's some good old stuff. got some weird sentences. They may be complete, but they're real long, to the point that I would say they've incompleted themselves.
Right. All right. What do you think about the divide of congregational and personal?
I'm generally in the same. I think I do almost more categories than you do on this one.
I was gonna say. I think you mentioned a third before.
I kind of go with, and it's a combination, thinking through theologically sound and Bob test, and then the idea of congregational personal, where I think you have songs that are theologically sound, direction, like all of the things that it's like I could play this in any worship context, anywhere, with any set of people, and it's clear what we're singing, and it works. And that goes in like my first category. And then my second category is like, maybe it's a little bit more vague, but it is written easy for us to sing, so it can work depending on your context, depending on the people you're around. And then as we move more towards the personal end, the far end of personal is just like, it's so complex that you can only listen to it, or only the most skilled can play it.
Right.
But as you're moving kind of in that spectrum, I think there lands a point where you say, either this song is all about me and my relationship to God, that it's no longer helpful for the group to sing, or it falls into this idea of, this is a very specific situation, and so I can't say, hey, we're all going to sing as if we understand the situation the same. And so that song is really great in personal worship, but no longer, even if it is singable, theologically sound, directionally right, it's so specific that it's like, well, I can't call everybody in the room to sing it, because maybe it's talking about struggling with self-doubt, which I don't think we don't need to sing that. Maybe if it's a portion of a song, but if the whole song's about self-doubt, and I come into a room and say, all right, everybody, let's sing about our self-doubt.
Right.
And there's 4 or 5 people in the room that are like, I mean, I've had it sometimes, but I don't really relate. It may run into the personal side of things. But yeah, I put it maybe more on a spectrum, in the sense of like, I think there are some songs that for certain congregations aren't congregational, and for other congregations they're very congregational.
Right.
And it can vary on the melodies. Like if I'm doing a Phil Wickham song that has a really high just chorus and really low verses, and you go into a congregation that loves singing straight up 4-verse hymns, it's no longer congregational for them, because they don't know how to sing that style. They don't relate to the, I'm going to sit back and listen more during the verse, and I'm going to sing out more during the chorus. And so it becomes uncongregational. In the same way, if I go into a congregation that's really used to singing African music in the heart of Africa and stuff, and I say, all right, we're going to stop and just sing a 4-verse hymn with the piano. It's like, now I've created it no longer congregational for them, because they don't sing in that way.
Right.
But I think in every context that you're in, you need to, one, say, who am I leading in worship? If you're the one picking it, obviously if you're not the one picking it, you don't really have to say. But if you're the one picking the song, say, who am I singing with? Is this a song that is going to help them and feel congregational? There's a song right now, it's out by Brandon Lake, called Gratitude, and I love the song. I use it for my personal worship, but there's some lines in it that are so situational, and like you have to know that feeling very specific, that it just, every time I've done it in congregational worship, I'm like, that section of the song just felt super awkward. It's like we're all trying to sing something that we don't all relate to, and then we get to the chorus and it's fine or whatever. And it's that kind of a song. It's like, I don't think that musically it's not congregational, or directionally it's not, but it's become this point that I'm like, though it may work functionally, it doesn't work practically. So I guess I use more of a spectrum than a 2-camp idea.
Right. Well, I guess mainly my idea with congregational versus personal is just like an end. How do we sort this song? Like, are we sorting it into stuff that we can use for both personal and for congregational worship, or are we going to sort this as to this is? You should probably just relegate this to personal.
Yeah.
I think there are, like you said, I think there are songs that are written that are so personal that aren't really conducive for congregational. But they're not that many of those.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I don't disagree with
well,
what
yeah,
you
I
were
think
saying.
as I would just use it a little bit more of a spectrum and say, hey, there's a song that I'm going to lean it more personal, but I think that there are certain congregations and certain times that this one's going to work. We were talking about a song just on Sunday that Jess Ray wrote with Mission House called If I Was a Bird, and it's a great song, but it's lyrically, it's like, it's weird to say, hey, let's all stand together and sing this.
Sing that we're birds.
But I've heard Jess lead it several times, and a lot of times she'll use it at the beginning of a service, and it's kind of one of those times that's like, hey, if you want to sing it, sing it. But if you also want to take this time to reflect, to pray, I'm not going to call you to be like, hey, you have to sing these words right now, whether you feel it or not. Which generally I think I hold for congregational worship. I think it is a little bit bold of us to be like, hey, you have to sing this. I think it is good and beneficial for worship leaders to say, hey, please stand and sing, but also remember, like, if you need to sit down, if you need to step to the side, if you need to pray, like, don't feel like, oh, I'm now required in this moment to feel and act this way.
I think that's where one of the strengths of having a special music or a choir song is, because you can use some of those songs that are really well written, but they're very specific in what they're doing. So maybe they're more technical, maybe they're more like experiential focused, or like personal situation focused, and you can use those in interesting ways to accent the greater congregational worship service.
Yeah.
To really drive it along. But there are downsides to special music and choir music. But that's another video for another day.
Yeah.
But I think that those can really be brought out a lot in those types of songs, or in that situation, even in congregational worship, because they have a specific design, and we want to use that design in unique ways, rather than just applying all the songs to congregational worship.
Yeah. Oh, I had one last thing before we.
Go ahead.
I think we're at the end. It was a statement on artistic license, and I don't think Owl disagrees with your stance on it. But I think one thing that we need to think about with artistic license is artistic license falls into that idea of, like, does it work for my congregation?
Right.
Like, there have been songs at different churches that I've led at, and even at our own, that people in our church, they come up and they not have a gripe with the song, but they sit there and they're like, I can't hear those words and picture the correct gospel. And I sit there and I was like, no, it's fine. Like, it's describing it well, but because of the terminology that's being used, distracting you or directing your mind away from what we do believe, and it's not so heinous that it's like, oh, it draws us away. I refrain from doing some of those songs, not because the artistic license was wrong, but because of the artistic license and the way our words are used in our context, it wasn't helpful for our congregation. And so there are some songs that it's like, I agree with, and I think are congregationally fine, and they sound they pass all of the guideline tests. But in my congregation, in my place and time, that word means something different, or that phrase doesn't direct your eyes to God in the way that it was intended to. And so we refrain from doing it. So I think there's a lot of wisdom needed in our worship leaders and our pastors and those that plan our worship times.
Yep. And if you're new here, really kind of the goal of my channel is really just to have us think about what we're doing, what is it that we are doing in our worship, both personally and congregational. Like, how can we best serve God's people in as we think about what we're saying in the music, what we're saying, and what when we use the word worship, what does that encompass? And so, like, my goal isn't to like tell you this is how you should do it. I mean, I am kind of telling you how you should do it, but my goal is really just to get people to think about what we're saying, what we're doing, and really, hopefully, just create great worship so that God can be glorified through it. And that's really the heart of what I'm trying to do. Thanks for coming, Jason. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. I appreciate you making it this far. If you want to see more of me and Jason just talking about random stuff in worship, let me know. I'd love to have him back on. And if you have any songs or anything about worship you want me to talk about, let me know in the comments. And I will catch you next time. Peace.